In this mini lesson, we'll be focusing on a valediction forbidding mourning by Donne. One of the reasons Vivian Baring, the 50-year-old protagonist from Wit, is so pleased with herself as being a professor of Donne's poetry is because Donne's poetry is widely considered to be some of the most complex, difficult poetry in the whole of the English canon. In saying that, if it takes you 3, 4, even 5 rounds of reading this poem before you really understand it, please do take the time because the ending is very rewarding. The title, Valediction Forbidding Mourning. A valediction is a statement made in farewell, so sort of like, when you have a valedictory dinner at school, when you're in year 12, or sometimes a celebrity will come in at a university to say their valedictory speech, and again that is when they're farewelling the cohort and bidding them on their way. To forbid is to disallow or prohibit, stop something, and mourning is when we feel deep sadness because we've lost something or we're grieving something. In simple terms, you could call this poem Goodbye, Do Not Mourn. Can link to personal context with this one. We know that this was written in 1611 or 1612 for Anne, his wife, who was heavily pregnant before he went to France. It is incredibly romantic, this poem, and it does get a little bit sexual, as Donne so often does. This poem doesn't really need a modernised version to access it, but there are some words that are useful to take note of. So a tempest is a violent storm. A profanation is to stain or bring something down. It's the opposite of sacred. If something is profane, it's not sacred. The laity, they're the ordinary people in a congregation, so not the clergy, not the priest or the reverend. Trepidation is a fancy way of saying fear, anxiety. Sublunary, one of my favourite words, love it. Under the moon, sublunar. Breach means to break or to sever, to part. To hearken is to listen out for something. And obliquely in this context means indirectly. The structure, as we can see there with the red font and the purple font, there's an A-B rhyme scheme, and there are 9 stanzas, or 9 quatrains is the correct term, because there are 4 lines in each stanza, for a total of 36 lines. The A-B rhyme scheme establishes a beautiful cadence. It feels comfortable, it feels comforting, it feels right, and the parts fit, and therefore the rhyme is fitting. We can refer to this as a masculine rhyme, which just means the stress falls on the last syllable of each line. That's the kind of phrase that we can use to ensure that our response is as sophisticated as it needs to be. There is some slant rhyme there to us, this modern audience, in the green, but I believe that is not a stylistic intention of Donne's. I think that's more to do with the way he would have pronounced those words, and I'm pretty sure that they would have rhymed at the time. We'll read it through once, and then if you need to come back to it, please do as many times as it takes. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say no. So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods nor sigh tempests move, to a profanation of our joys to tell the laity our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears, men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. Dull, sublunary lovers' love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence, because it doth remove those things which elemented it. but we by a love so much refined, that ourselves know not what it is, inter-assured of the mind, careless eyes, lips, and hands to miss. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion. Like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth, if the other do. And though it in the centre sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. We can make a really interesting link between this poem and the way Donne uses his wit with that metaphysical conceit, and we can link it to the title of Edson's play being Wit, and the way that this is ironic, because Baring, though she studies Donne's poetry, she lacks wit when it comes to intimacy and kindness and compassion and love, whereas he is very tender and very sweet in this poem. So there's different types of intelligences being illustrated in each text. So it's one of the most famous metaphysical conceits of all time, and he is comparing two very different things. He's saying that the lover's love is like the two legs of a compass. That's weird, it's unusual, it's original, but it's a very good example of proper metaphorical wit, metaphysical wit that should read, because as the metaphor continues and he draws further and further similarities, it really does work. You're like, yes, that makes perfect sense what he's saying with the legs and the I'm moving away and yet we're expanding and so forth. Stanza 1 reads, as virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say no. It's an abrupt opening. This is characteristic of Donne's style. He often does that. But he has this juxtaposition here with virtuous men, men who have been strong and moral and right in their lives, and that their deaths are actually quiet, they're mild, there's a whisper on their deaths. It's not a big fanfare, a big fuss being made, even though they lived a huge, big, bold life. Metaphorically, he says, let us melt and make no noise. The quietness of that line mirrors the silence and the softness that he's trying to suggest they leave one another with. When he says that it would be a profanation of our joys, profane is the opposite of sacred. So he's saying if we're to shout and carry on and cry really loudly, that would bring our holy love down a notch. And we don't want to tell the rest of the congregation, those lay people, the people who are not as special as you and I, by screaming and carrying on. So he's saying, keep it small, keep your reactions small. And that religious language there, profanation and laity, elevates Donne's and his wife's love to being more holy than anybody else's. And of course you can link to the Christian worldview of that period, which is quite different to the secularism of Edson's text. When Donne uses inclusive language, much as he does in The Sun Rising, very similar, it creates a sense of unity and beauty in this duo, but it also separates us from it. And those lovely words there, joy and love, just emphasises the beauty. This is an interesting idea where he's talking about the way the outward show of something is not necessarily indicative of its true meaning. So he says, for example, earthquakes, when the moving of the earth brings harms and fears, and people try to figure out what it meant. And also when there's movement and anxiety about the stars and the planets moving and so forth, sometimes there's massive movement up there and yet it has no real world consequence. So he's saying, just because we're about to part with one another, it doesn't mean that we have to cry really loudly and show everybody that we're upset, because the outward show is not an indication of the real love that's going on deep down. When he refers to the dull, sublunary lover's love, there's assonance there in that open U sound, dull, sub, love. And it again elevates the speaker and his beloved to being above the moon, to being beyond the worldly realm. Their love is above the moon, whereas everybody else's love is sublunary. They're those other people whose love is less than ours. And that assonance just emphasizes that everyone else's love is dull compared to theirs. Sounds boring. And this idea here in line 3, when he says that those dull sublunary lovers cannot admit absence, they cannot allow for absence, because if they're apart from one another, the things that began the love are no longer around, and therefore their love dissolves. Unlike his and Anne's love, which is so special that it's not about the physical, it's not about, I love your blue eyes, or I love your red hair, or whatever it might be. Their love is beyond that. But people whose love is base and ordinary, the minute they're away from one another, the love dies, because the payoff that they were getting from one another in each other's presence is no longer there and can't keep the love together. As it says there, we can part because our love does not dissolve simply because we're away from one another, but it does for everyone else. And then he uses here that conjunction of opposition, but we are different. This couple's separate and better. He says, but we by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is. So even Donne and Anne cannot explain their love. It's otherworldly, it's unfathomable, mysterious, inexplicable. And then when he says that they're inter-assured of the mind, love that phrase. It's like ESP almost, that they love one another in a way that is not physical. It's just they know in each other's mind of the depth of their love. More inclusive language there, we and our. And this line I think is really memorable too. The listing when he says, we're inter-assured of the mind and therefore care less about eyes, lips and hands. We're not interested in just this physical base kind of love. We're not worried about missing those things because we're inter-assured of our minds. The second half of this poem just gets better and better with each stanza. The writing, I think, is immaculate. Donne deserves to be up there. He says, our two souls, therefore, which are one. Beautiful, simple language, high certainty, speaking it as though it's a fact. Our two souls are one. You could link here to the Christian context and the real belief of the time, and even today, that marriage is the fusing of two people into one person. He says, though I must go, Endure not yet a breach, but an expansion. That line is so beautiful. He's saying, I'm leaving, but because we are one, if I move away from you, we're just expanding. We're getting bigger. And he says, like gold to airy thinness beat. He's saying here that it's just like the beating of gold when something of high value, something really pure and gorgeous, is beaten, as it is when you beat gold into thin leaves of gold. Their love is going to be stretched, but it's going to be made all the more beautiful, all the more delicate because of that expansion. And it links a little bit to the context there too, where during Donne's time, people were trying to figure out how to get gold by mixing different minerals and so forth. So it's alchemical in its theme there. The metaphor or the conceit continues. If they be two, they are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. As it says, though we are two souls, if we are two souls, even though we've become one, we are connected like the stiff legs of a compass. So Donne is the leg in the centre, and Donne is the one moving away from the centre. So despite their separation, their union will expand. They are inexorably connected. As he says there in green, thy soul, your soul, the fixed foot, the foot that stays at home, makes no show to move. You can't tell that it's moving. And this is true when you twist the little compass. You can't tell that the fixed foot is actually twisting on the page. But you can tell that the foot that's making the big circle is moving. And they're actually both moving. So if Anne Donne, the fixed foot, moves, then John Donne moves too, and vice versa. And he continues, and though it in the centre sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it. So Anne is in the centre of the circle, and when John roams, she leans towards him and hearkens after him, listens out for him. And this has this beautiful sense of longing. He's moving away, she is leaning towards him and listening for him. And then, as so often Donne does, he refers here quite explicitly to the fact that there's an erection that happens when he comes home. So whilst earlier in the poem they're referring to how they've got this inter-assured mind that doesn't worry too much about the lips, the hands and so forth, there is also a sensuality and sexuality that is to be reunited when this couple are in one another's zones. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. As I move, you too will move. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. So very clever. This idea of the compass, this is why this conceit works so well, because he's saying, I'm going to go travel all around the place, and you're going to stay at home, and our love is going to expand. It's not going to be breached. It's not going to be severed. It's going to broaden. It's going to widen. And as he comes home, not only will he grow erect, but he's starting at the place he began. So he's returning home. And because when we use a compass, there's this symbolism of the eternity, like wedding rings are circles because they don't have an ending. And perfection, circles are often seen as perfection. And when he returns home, their love is bigger and better then it was. And it's that simplicity of that last line there where he says, your firmness makes my circle just. So like, you stay home, you be strong, and you hold the fort. And that firmness there too could reference perhaps her arousal as well, or just her strength. And he's saying, in your strength at home, as I travel around the place, you're going to help make my circle, my travels, just and perfect, exactly the way a compass works, where you've got the fixed foot and the circle is a perfect circle as long as that fixed foot remains fixed and strong. If that weakens, everything weakens. And those two lines too, where he says, her firmness makes his circle just means perfect, exact, precise, and makes me end where I begun. That repetition there of makes it feel magnetic and compulsion. And if she's being left at home and he's saying, I will return to you because your firmness will make me return, you can imagine that she would feel that she doesn't need to cry and be incredibly outward with her sadness, but she can just wait for him and wait for his return. An incredibly romantic, beautiful poem, and I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. Similarities and differences between these texts. Both Donne and Vivian Baring are highly intelligent. However, Donne's intelligence does not prohibit him from feeling love. So in that poem, he expresses an incredible tenderness, whereas Baring's intelligence seems to have reduced her ability to feel for others. She makes some headway with that. She becomes softened. She becomes sweeter and more able to recognize the importance of kindness as she declines in her health. But the flashbacks we see of her where she's a bit mean to her students and unable to relate to her peers or not play with them, but talk to them in the quadrangle. And of course there's an irony there that is well worth mentioning because it's a complex connection between the texts. Baring is a scholar of Donne's work, and yet she hasn't learnt how to love the way he can express his love. So she could have learnt that from him, but she doesn't. Both Donne's poem and Edson's play are written from her first-hand experience. So Donne really did leave his wife, Anne, for an extended period of time to go on a diplomatic journey to France. And Edson knows what she's writing about too. She has a master's in English literature, so understands the pretension and the pompousness that can come with that field. And also she has a good understanding of the systematic and officiousness of the modern medical industry, and is therefore well placed to use her play to critique it, and she does that very well. If you'd like more HSC English resources, please head to the link in the description below. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe so that you'll get notified when the other lessons on Donne's other poems are complete. Thank you.